our learning outcomes.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
That's perfect with double R. Yeah, right. Okay. All right. So I will be starting my screen share. Just a
Yeah.
moment. Uh,
Excellent.
Step.
Okay, Possum. Don't step on the keyboard.
It's a
Yeah.
very important conversation. So can you see my slides?
Yes, I can. And I even looked through them before our meeting and I was feeling very prepared and awesome about that too.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for going through them. So
Yeah.
I believe it is visible right here.
Yes. Yes.
All right. So I will get cracking. So probably, as discussed, I'll take about 30 minutes probably,
Yeah.
and then we can have like a discussion of sorts. I will stop the sharing, and
Yeah.
then what I will do is I will share the presentation with you, so
Mhm.
that you can share it with your students. I will be sharing it in a PDF form, and
Yeah.
as you might see here, that there are certain things which are hyperlinked,
Yeah.
right? There are certain things which are hyperlinked. So there are some resources that I have tagged along, so which
Mhm.
may help the students in following up in certain issues as well.
Yeah.
All right. So today's talk or whatever this is, it's digital humanities and community building. So I am Samya Brata. I am a PhD candidate here at IIT Jodhpur in India, which is in a state called Rajasthan. And this topic and this perhaps deliberation is born from my experience, and then it coincides and overlaps with my research. So I will kind of try to navigate these issues with my own lived experience as well, and I hope that you get to take it out some of your areas as well. So first things first that I'd like to talk about is I would start with Walter Om, but it's not like a hard and fast reference to him or his theory. I will be using it in a kind of a decontextualized manner. So this particular statement that he uses, that writing is a technology that restructures thought. Now, of course, this has a lot of other connotations, debates, and what is external, what is internal. I'm not going into that. I'm not even explaining why I have chosen this particular line right here. I will perhaps do that in my next slide. But first, I will be talking about this particular issue about barriers, which is to merit. Now, how does digital humanities come to the picture? Where does community building come to the picture? That I believe will be revealed in the due course of this conversation. At least that's what I can hope for. So, first things is barrier and to merit. Now, this whole idea of the merit, that certain students are meritorious, hence they deserve certain things, and certain students are not meritorious, is an idea that is extremely prevalent in the culture that where I have grown from. I cannot speak about other cultures, but of course, in my culture, it's pretty prevalent. And I think that it exists in some shape or form in other spaces and conversations as well. So first things first is to address this whole notion, or in order to bring a kind of a hard-ish term, this idea of the merit as a myth. Because I think that how cultural capital functions and how people's interests work in varied and variegated ways, it has almost zero or no manifestations to someone's intrinsic merit, because it has a lot to do with their social and intersectional positions in society. Uh, and Dr. Schuster, if you want to have conversations with me, please feel free to interrupt and speak. Just, yeah, I'm just holding my
Okay.
position.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not as if we'll have to talk at the end, so you can have conversations in the middle as well.
Yeah.
Uh, Now, this whole idea, why do I start off with this idea of merit as a barrier? Because I feel that it's not just about someone's competency in a subject or someone's let's say liking of a subject. It also has to do with what kind of a class and caste position, especially I'm speaking from Indian context, of course. What class and caste position do they come from? How many people in their family have had access to that kind of an education? And boiling down to the very, very basic fact that what books did you see in your shelves in your living room when you were growing up? That kind of an exposure and that kind of a cultural capital that you have associated yourself with when you're growing up has direct relations to what you can possibly achieve in your life. And as it is extremely evident that not everyone has that kind of an exposure, so as to speak. Now, that kind of some kind of an inequality that exists off the bat, that gets reflected and highlighted in higher education even more so. How? The first, now this is where I come to the part of barriers. First is anxiety. Now I have spoken to a lot of my students, and also my earlier peers, my friends and my seniors, and I have noticed this one particular thing where they have told me. Now of course these aren't backed by data or quantitative research, this comes from my life experiences, so you are very welcome to challenge me on this, and I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you on this. Now, what I have faced repeatedly is what people telling me that, I'm so afraid to talk to professors. What if they tell me something? What if they tell me that I do not know something, etc., etc. So this kind of an anxiety I feel is born from the fact that you are an outsider in the industry. Because academics, if you take this as an industry, if you do not already have people who can break the ice for you, and you have to do it all alone in yourself, then that becomes a problem in itself. So overcoming that barrier becomes very easy if you have an uncle or an aunt or your parents in academia, and they can just introduce you to someone who's also a professor over, let's say, the dinner table, and something or the other. Now, that is one huge barrier. And then comes another thing where we, as young students, when we were doing our bachelor's, we were expected to kind of follow a certain paradigm and not go beyond it. Our teachers were extremely careful to make sure that we, as students, try to earn as much as grades we can from our university, because it was not always a very forgiving system. But the flip side of the coin is that if there were students who wanted to branch out, who wanted to diversify and do certain other things and get in touch with people and work on seminars or papers and conferences, let's say, that is not always looked at a good light, because it is seen as if you are deviating from the sacrosanct notion of the syllabi, and you are venturing into wild territories which you are not supposed to. You are supposed to obey, obey, and obey, right? So but and also these kind of activities are not pedagogically they are not pedagogically validated as well. For example, when I was doing my bachelor's, for example, when we had to start a literary society, we came across a lot of hurdles and challenges in order to do so. Now, if you may understand that bringing together people also is an act of networking, is an act of community building. It doesn't always have to be have a registration, a website, a Twitter account, etc., etc. There can be alternate infrastructures as well, which can be developed in one's own capacity as a young student. So we faced a lot of hurdles because people had different timetables, and it was seen as something which is beyond the syllabus and which would not reward the students directly. But when I went into a different academic environment later on in my career, I saw that the curriculum suggested that students should get involved in societies, they should form clubs, and they should run the clubs. And they had credit points associated that, and it directly reflected on their grade sheet. Now, this is what I'm talking about. That networking, collaboration, and community building must reflect on the curriculum itself. Otherwise, you cannot expect the students to think out of the box. Now, this is once again the shadow of Walter Ong, I believe, is growing in this conversation as we speak. Now, tied to this is the notion of the grading logic and ultra conservatism when it comes to grading. Because where I come from, once again, these are lived experiences, and you can always challenge me on this. Not that I will always agree, but well. Uh, so, ultra conservatism when it comes to grading, that no matter how you perform or what you do, you are kind of throttled to a kind of grade that apparently that is something that you deserve, and not even God can say that how you should write and how you should perform in order to obtain something that you hope for. So it's like the predicament of that line in King Lear where we say that to flies like fly as flies to wanted boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. So we felt like flies in the hands of examiners, and they killed us for their sport. Basically, that may be a little harsh, but you understand that this is coming from a place of pain. So yeah, I would not say deal with it, but deal with it. Now, Now, this kind of an ultra conservatism can be a little detrimental to a student's progress, because if you are expected to regurgitate certain stereotypical conversations over and over across generations and across eras, and you expect students to think out of the block, out of the box, or out of whatever polygon that you may fancy, that can be very problematic, because the pedagogy, the structure doesn't support this kind of an atmosphere, and expecting that from the students is absolutely unfair. Coming to research and networking support. Now, even the many doctoral candidates, they are shy, and they do not get the proper research infrastructures and support that they deserve. So when we talk about pre-doctoral scenarios where students get interested in research, where the metaphorical seeds of academia are sown, and in brackets, life is about to be ruined. Of course, that's a joke. So that kind of an impetus, where one is supposed to be allowed to think beyond a certain barrier, that yes, you can think about research, yes, you can do this, you can do that, that support is not always available. And that may be because of the two preceding reasons that I said. So as you can see, that all these impediments directly focus on how someone thinks, and this is where I go to the next one, and I will explain why I started with Walter Ong here. So this is what I call networking in the belly of the beast. I offer a contextualization, you can call this a kind of a framework, which leads to what Alan Liu addresses, which I will come to. That first of all is the pre-existing idea of cultural capital, where you have that kind of an exposure, where you have grown up with certain advantages, with certain books and certain cultures and certain senses of what is what, that other people from different intersectional positions may not have had the privilege of doing so. So first is the idea of cultural capital, which now comes in contact with mode of expression and how it changes thought. Now, Walter Ong talks about how writing as a technology restructures thought. If you talk about how a student is expected to perform in their courses, they are also supposed to write papers or write exams or give presentations. So a student in due course of their degree is also supposed to express themselves. And the mode in which they express themselves changes how they think. If a student is said that you have to come up with an original research paper, an idea, and you will be graded in terms of how original your idea is, a student will think. But if you tell a student that you are supposed to regurgitate answers from the last millennia, probably that kind of a thing will not happen. Now, this is something that is to be noted as well, that not all university structures can support this kind of a dynamic sense of learning, because there are many universities which are democratic in nature and which have a lot of students. So simply that kind of an infrastructure is not there. But my point is not about the presence or absence of infrastructure. My point is about that when an individual student has some kind of an interest growing in a certain field which the so-called syllabi doesn't accommodate, what is the ethical responsibility of a teacher or a professor in order to guide the student in that particular domain? I have been extremely fortunate to have had fantastic guides in all stages of life who have pushed me towards a kind of a direction. But there may be other people who are not as privileged as I am. Now, self privilege and attribution and recognition of your own privilege is something that I will come to at the end of my talk. But these are something. So now, when cultural capital combined with mode of expression, that creates a lot of baggage. If someone does not have cultural capital, and on top of that, they are supposed to be conventional, they're supposed to be restrictive. So, how can someone like that be expected to produce original research? So I believe it is an implicitly systemic way of thwarting someone's I don't know, eventual progress, if you can call it like that. But of course, that is something that we can speculate. Infrastructural changes take a very long time to happen, and especially in democratic setups of universities which have huge number of colleges operating under them. And I very well understand that it is not possible. And I keep reiterating that I am talking about an ethical responsibility in the part of the teachers, and not necessarily always bringing about infrastructural or curriculum change, which of course takes a lot of time. But at the end of the day, one must think about how to change the curriculum, and change the curriculum because the curriculum needs to be changed, and not because your university license can be cancelled and then you change the curriculum. That's not how it works. I'm sorry. And then finally, these two concepts bring us to what Alan Liu addresses in his seminal 2016 paper, which critiques the state of DH, where he says that digital humanities has grown in size and it has become a thing of its own. Now, can digital humanities address the problems of the humanities in itself? Does DH have the potential of doing that? Karsten, there is some sound coming, so if you can turn off your mic, I mean, maybe.
Yes. Hold on. Sorry.
So if you want to say something, you can. But yeah, there's some disturbance. I thought of pointing that out. So can digital humanities as a so-called quote-unquote discipline, because always we have the debate whether it's a discipline or a method, and that debate has been over-debated, but that's not the point here. Now, can digital humanities disciplines or research methods or whatever it may be address these so-called intrinsic problems that people from the humanities face, be it in terms of community, thought process, building original arguments, or networking for the sake of the matter? Now, can it? I will be, of course, giving you some case studies, some things, some certain works that have been done in the field of DH. I will be using them as case studies to talk about how they have addressed these systemic issues and how we can counter these issues, of course. Now, first of all, I will be referring to this tweet by Rubika Risam. The Professor Risam is someone that I hugely admire. She is an associate professor at Dartmouth. And this tweet really hit home because this is a kind of predicament that we as people of color, of course, we have considerable amount of privilege, but we have also faced this. So it's no exaggeration that I, like many other scholars of color, owe my career to Twitter, to the communities we have built, to the ways we can amplify each other's work, to the ability to find connections when academic institutions disconnect us. I would like to think about this tweet for just a moment, because before we proceed to the button, there is always a button, right? So we owe our careers to Twitter. I mean, this might sound a bit on the face, especially when the whole shadow of Elon Musk is lurking above our collective heads, but to actually get the essence of what Dr. Risam is trying to address here is that still the notion of being on Twitter for academic networking, especially the hallowed chambers of the global north academia, still exists very much on Twitter. And that is something I have even faced, that being on Twitter is absolutely necessary when you talk about someone's academic networking when it comes to Twitter, especially when it comes to digital humanities. And I can prove that with Martin's research that I will be talking about in the upcoming slides. To the communities that we have built, of course, I use Twitter greatly myself, and I inspire other juniors and peers of mine to please go on Twitter, because that is where you get a random retweet that talks about a funding opportunity. So it's like a network thing that helps you understand what discourse is happening in your field, if I'm allowed to call it that. But there is a problem with some conversations and some contestations being siloed to one space like Twitter. While it is important, and Professor Risam also agrees, because if you look at her recent tweet, she has been talking about migrating to Mastodon and having other alternate profiles in social media as well. Now, we can amplify each other's work. Now, later on, I will be talking about something related to ethical citation, where this will be a much greater cause of conversation. But amplify each other's work and the ability to find connections when academic institutions disconnect us. Now, I do not necessarily think that academic institutions disconnect us, but I agree with what Dr. Risam says. Academic institutions doesn't explicitly disconnect us, but it does so implicitly. And that is how we need to transcend the boundaries of the academic institution and form solidarity from societies and communities outside the institutions. And this is where my own life experience comes into the picture. That is what something that I will be talking about after I talk about the slight issue with the space of Twitter. Now, this is Martin Grangin's research. Must be butchering his pronunciation, they pronunciation, and I apologize in advance for that. Now, the person has this work called Mapping DH Twitter. Of course, I have hyperlinked the paper here, so you can check it out if you want, and I will be sharing my PPT with you. what the person does is that this is the I think this is the data from the year 2016, if I'm not wrong. What the person does is to do a social network analysis of about 2,500 users who are following each other. Now, all these white circles that you see, these are the people who are like popular. And this is like 2,500 users. Now, if you compare this to this one, you see the dots which are white, they are the ones who speak English. And this blue cluster right here is French, and the yellow cluster is German. And somewhere you see some black, which is other, and some red, which is Spanish. So it is very clearly extremely English at this point. And therefore, especially when we talk about not just people who write or express themselves in another language, but also people like us who may express themselves in English but come from predominantly non English, non Anglophonic cultures. So, a space which has a space like Twitter, which has the immense potential to connect, also has the potential to silo off conversations and disconnect others, not explicitly but implicitly. And we must be extremely aware of how these infrastructures connect and disconnect us. So, how can we battle this so-called English insularity? Now, I'll be referring to a few of the research that has been done, including my own. Please excuse my reference. So, first off, Quinn Dombrowski in the recent 2022 Tokyo ADHO conference mentioned this line, which I think is very powerful. That don't just mention that you are doing digital humanities, but digital humanities in English. Acknowledgement of the language in which you operate. And now this the social network analysis of DH or doing DH in other English terms is not just limited to DH. You can easily do a social network analysis of any other field for that matter, and I believe the result will correlate in some shape or form if it is done in almost similar manner. For example, if you do something like an analysis of the field of sociology or English, of course, English, it's pretty apparent. I think that the English dominance is still very much there. And hence, this idea, as I say, keep saying, it starts with an ethical perspective of acknowledging what you do and in which language you do. In this context, going back to DH 2014 and Elika Ortega's idea of the DH whisperer, which talks about translating conference talks and abstracts in different languages, which makes things easier for other people to understand. Now, building these alternate possibilities is very important to connect people from different cultures so that they can come and talk to another. Now, getting inspired by these ideas, I'll talk about the kind of little paper thing that I did for DH 2022 in Tokyo this year. It was virtual, of course. So I talked about translation as the performance of negotiation in digital humanities. Now, I, as someone, my mother tongue is what I know to be as Bangla or Bengali. But in my school, throughout, I have learned English as my first language. And I am much more comfortable in English, whether it comes to speaking, writing, or talking, than I am in Bangla. Of course, I talk equally, I read well, but when it comes to writing, I can markedly say that I'm much more comfortable in English than I am in Bangla. This is a very dedicated post colonial condition. And this is something that many of us understand and relate to from a kind of post colonial context. But having said that, when this opportunity of mine came to do Twitter translations in Bangla for digital humanities talks for the OSS Practice and INK Project Conference and also for Digital Humanities Summer Institute 2021, I grabbed the opportunity. Other than the fact that they were offering remuneration, which is of course important for a young graduate student like me, there was a kind of ideological problem that I wanted to address. Yes, I am not good in Bangla. Yes, maybe tweeting in Bangla in digital humanities will not get that many eyeballs on Twitter. Then why do I do it? I do it just for the sake of visuality, for translation as performance, so that people can at least see that there is work that is being done in Bangla and that can be taken forward by other people. It has to exist, it has to be visible in the first place. People must know that it is possible in order for the work to carry on. I may not be able to express my DH concerns in Bangla as well as maybe someone down the years, 5 years down the line, who may be able to do so. So that is why, even if you are not comfortable in something, this political idea of making the other languages visible, and to say that yes, the counter discourse, the non-English discourse also exists, is an extremely political act as far as I am concerned. Now that is one way. The other way is actually having conferences in the so-called majority worlds or in the global south. Now this is a 2018 paper by Nebbiolo and Palermo that came out in 2019, where they talk about the DH 2018 conference and how it was hosted in Mexico, and how that gave an opportunity to students to come together and actually have conversations in a refreshingly diverse amount of languages and possibilities. And the same thing happened in Tokyo this year. The amount of effort that was given in terms of translation and in terms to ensure accessibility, especially in pandemic times, was commendable indeed. Of course, there have been pitfalls and there have been problems, but this kind of an attitude is something that is very important. Of course, there are problems. What kind of problems are they? That as we, as young students, we aspire that for a conference we will travel to a kind of a hegemonic location in Europe, that it's not only going to serve our academic aspirations but also our personal aspirations, coming from middle class family, that we get to tell our family members, etc., that we got to travel abroad. So that is like a middle class dream of the people. But how can this be countered? Is this not counterable? Of course it is. That is that the institutions and the conference organizing committees must make an effort to not only have conferences in America and Europe, but also in other places like Mexico, Japan, India, South Africa, and so on and so forth. So these are certain issues that we have to acknowledge in order to undercut these boundaries. And this is something that we can do sitting in the field of digital humanities. As I keep saying, that I keep using DH as a case study to talk about community building, but this can be applicable to any discipline in certain shape or form. Now, what are the other ways? What are the other spaces of expressions, if you know? Now, Twitter, as I started off with, is under fire. And to borrow a Marxian line, that a specter of Elon Musk is growing, and we need to address that, right? So, the other alternate modes of conversations include stuff like Discord, Mastodon, and they have even dug up the old ghost of LinkedIn. But of course, these spaces, of course, diversification is important, but it is also important to note that not all spaces are accessible in every geopolitical locations because of certain restrictions. There are maybe places where Twitter is banned or Discord is banned. There may be places, for example, in India, TikTok is banned, and in China there are many other things that do not work, and they have alternate infrastructures of their own. So how can we come together? Can we come together? Can we build spaces in an alternate way? I here would like to offer the example of hashtag and Humanities Commons, which of course has combined now to hashtag Commons, which tries to build a community, which tries to have a kind of social media for academics, if you will. But of course, it's one organization. It also has its limitations. It has its spaces of operations, and it may implicitly exclude people who do not know about this. So it is the responsibility on people like you, people like me, to branch out and reach out to other people and actually talk about these spaces where people can come together and collaborate. Collaboration or networking doesn't always happen from the student to the professor, but sometimes it also has to come down from the professor to the student while maintaining a sense of professionalism, of course. And that is something that we as aspiring academics or academics must be extremely cognizant towards, is that what efforts are we making to reach out to the academicians of the future? What efforts are we consciously putting to reach out to people who may not have ended up in academics but will, if these consolidated efforts actually come into practice? Now, why here? What have I experienced and what have I been able to contribute? And I will be offering these examples with three organizations that I have been a part of, and one of them I have been a founder of. I have been extremely fortunate to have been able to carry that out in my own very, very limited ways. Now, the thing that you see in @ elite India, @dh_dharti, @digra_India, these are Twitter handles of these organizations that I will be talking about. And please follow these organizations on Twitter so that you can come across the discussions that happen in our spaces. Uh, but yes, Dharti is a Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations, and I serve in the executive committee of this organization, as I am a technical advisory member of Humanities Commons and a scholar of Hashtag as well. I'm also associated with Digra India just as a member. I do not hold any position over there, and I am a founder member of the Electronic Literature India. Now, how did these spaces come about? Now, this is something that I call communities of communities, where communities come together and form overlaps, and which inspires others to create communities on their own. Uh, Kirsten, just to check, I am being perfectly audible, right? And my connection is fine.
Yes, everything's working fine for me. Yeah.
Cool. All right. And the recording is also working, right? Just to have a check.
Yes, I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. No
Yeah.
worries. No worries. No worries. Okay. So in 2019, when I went to IIT Gandhinagar for Winter's Institute in Digital Humanities, I came across Dr. Dibyaduti Roy, who introduced me to this body called Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations. And it is through him and other members that I have made where I have understood the extreme value and importance of something like having a society. For example, when I was a master's student, I always wanted to pursue something like, let's say, video game studies or comic studies, etc., etc. But it was not always possible, or it was not always justified to have that your university will provide you with everything that you want. So, in this context, I branched out and I got to know that there is something called digital humanities, which talks about the digital. I was interested. It piqued my interest. My interest was actually born from games, but then I was told by a senior of mine who has had finally she has gotten her PhD degree, Dr. Poonam Chaudhary. I am very indebted to her because she was the one who introduced me to digital humanities, that workshop. So there I met these people, there I formed networks and connections, and in due course of conversations, I also got in touch with Digra India, which used to be Game Studies India, run by Shovik Mukherjee, someone whose work I have been admiring for a very long time. So the question is, what has this got to do with privilege? I'll tell you what. Now, in order to attend the workshop in IIT Gandhinagar, I was staying in Hyderabad at one point of time, which is near the southern part of India, and Gandhinagar is towards the northern part, towards the northwestern part of India. In order to travel and in order to attend the conference, I had to spend about 20,000 rupees. I leave the exchanging and the converting of the currency to you. When I asked my father if I could attend it, he was ready at one go. He gave me the money, and I was able to travel, and I was able to attend this event, which, for the lack of a better word, changed my life. Now, later on, I have met people who have told me that they also wanted to attend this workshop, but they couldn't because they didn't have the money. Now, it's not always possible to expect that organizations will always offer scholarships, because there are many times where they're also strapped, and it is very expensive to organize a 2 week Indo Canadian workshop. So that has to be kept in mind as well. So I am talking about my privilege and how, in order to access communities, sometimes you need privilege, which is not always explicit. So, what can we do to address this? We can take part in reach out activities, of course, we can do that. But there is always a limitation to what we can do, and we must always acknowledge our implicit biases. Now, with the extreme level of camaraderie, comradeship, mentorship, whatever you want to call it, that I received from these fields, Dharti and Digra, I decided that because I work in electronic literature, I must create a community that brings together perhaps like-minded people of my own. And that inspired me to start Electronic Literature India. Now, as you may see, that there is a WhatsApp icon lurking about. Why? It is because many of these groups primarily function on WhatsApp. Digra and Dharti have their websites and Twitter and other forms of social media, but Electronic Literature India doesn't, because it is handled by myself and a few other people who contribute and for whose efforts I'm extremely grateful for. It doesn't have a website, it only has a Twitter, which is extremely sporadic, and it has a WhatsApp group where it functions. I, as a graduate student, I do not have the bandwidth to carry out this much work, but I must do what I can with what I have. That is what. Infrastructures are malleable, they're pocketable, and to borrow the words of Aisha to Godabe, it infrastructures can also exist in buckets or bucket infrastructures, small infrastructures. Do what you have. Don't wait for bigger things to happen. Just do with what you have, and things, if they are meant to happen, it will happen. So, yes, there were challenges. There were people who joined the group who did not have an idea what we're talking about and they left. There were people who were spamming the group for no reasons and they had to be kicked out. Of course, there are these, but we as a group are slowly navigating towards understanding what it is, what electronic literature is all about, because the discipline is, it would be an understatement to say that it is even nascent in the country. But we as a group pulled off our first panel in the Dharti 2022 conference, which I was extremely fortunate to chair, where I had two co-panelists speaking about electronic literature. And there is one major conference that is coming up on electronic literature in India, which is being done by Jamia Media, where I will be also involved as in some capacity as a speaker. So we are using these channels, Dharti, Digra, and Electronic Literature India, to promote these resources and support each other's works in whatever spaces, in whatever ways we can. Now, what is the COVID vaccine, COVID virus doing here? The vaccine was a very interesting Freudian slip, but I will move on with it. Uh, During COVID, we suspended, especially, you must have seen the scary visuals that came out of India during the peak of the second wave. What we decided to do during COVID was to suspend all academic activities. And people were using these spaces just to share vacant hospital beds, available oxygen cylinders to people in need. And we have actually managed to save lives because of it. That is not an understatement. So, as a community, it not only becomes important to know when to work, but also to understand when to not work and when to support each other as human beings. So, what can we possibly do further? This is something that I am drawing from my recent presentation in Italy for the ELO conference. As you can see that in brackets, I have mentioned like DHSI or the UK, Ireland DH, where I have spoken before, just acknowledging where I have been privileged enough to talk. So, did a survey based on the initial members who signed up for Electronic Literature India. And I asked them these questions. I asked them three questions. And this is a kind of response tabulation that I did. Why did you join the group? Have you benefited and engaged with ELIT? If so, please elaborate and provide links. If not, please elaborate why. What do you expect from the group moving forward? And as you can see in the answers, exploring and interacting, digital and access, networking, ethics, production, consumption, passing on knowledge, group discussion, everything has to do with community building and formation. So it does affect lives and it has the potentiality to change them when you actually want to make an effort. Now, another coming from starting off from social networks and its politics, moving on to community building, and now moving on to another domain, another example that I want to provide is the idea of citational politics and how a DH scholarship has identified, of course, other people have also identified, but I'm using a dedicated DH example because the talk is, of course, digital humanities and community building, right? Now, I will, of course, referring to this paper by Amy Earhart, Rupika Risam, and Matthew Bruno. And the article is called Citational Politics, Quantifying the Influence of Gender on Citation in Digital Scholarship in the Humanities. So they quantify citations by gender and by men authors and by women authors. So as you can see, if you just look at the samples that they have used, of course, you're free to check out the paper on your own. It's hyperlinked and I will share the slides, of course. That in the total citations by gender metric, Men have a domination of 71.9%, followed by women 22%, 22.7% for organizations, and a staggering zero for people with non binary affiliations. Now, what happens when men cite? What happens when the author is a man? Of course, men 79.4%, women 15.3%, and so on. But what happens when it is citations by women? Still, men occupy a lion's share of 16.1%, women with 32.2%. Now, it is also true that historically speaking, men have produced more scholarship than women because of gender politics, of course. But it is not as if in certain cases there are not people who produce scholarship who are not men, or men who come from a particular demographic, people from the global north, etc., etc. So our citations, who we cite, is also an extremely political act because this directly affects on someone's citation count, H index, etc., 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 which directly has a bearing with recruitment policies. And how does citations operate? People cite ideas or people they know. And how do they know these people? Via networking. And these communities that happen through networking, the people who cite their friends, even I do the same thing. They do not always realize that this is also an act of bias. Collaboration is also an act of bias because we choose who we collaborate with. Of course, we do. I do the same thing, you do the same thing, everyone does the same thing. So, what can we do? We can just ensure that we are trying to bring more voices on the table. And what does digital humanities do? Digital humanities shows us the possibilities and the problems. And it can give us a platform to build forward. It can be read that DH operates as a methodology to look into these politics of community building, citations, politics, and multilingualism, and so on and so forth. So, where does it all begin? As I said earlier, and as I will say again, it begins from an ethical perspective, a critical examination of one's privilege. It starts with an ethical position of the individual and the desire to do something, and also by taking accountability for yourself and for the others. And last but not the least, I leave links to these two so-called games, which says Check Your Privilege, which is a project done by Barbara Bordalejo, someone I really look up to, someone who I consider as one of my godmothers in academia, and Daniel Paul O'Donnell. This is a very interesting game which kind of lets you check your privilege. And also this project Implicit by Greenwald, Banerjee, and Nozak. These help you understand your position in society. And be it multilingualism, be it networking or the decentering of networking, or community building, or ethical practicing of citations, they are all connected towards a similar drive towards a more diverse and more inclusive forms of discourse. So I hope I was able to make some sense. And these are my socials. Feel free to get in touch. Yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you. I will be stopping sharing right now.
I like how you're saying that's all from your side. Like that wasn't really just kind of like a well structured and quite kind of insightful conversation about the problems with academia that are kind of systemic because they start from a very early point in a person's career and can
Yes.
kind of cascade and follow forward or feed
Yes.
forward, I should say.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I do like that. That's all. That's all from me for now. Sorry. How would you like to kind of manage the next bit? Would you like me to do a structured response or ask some questions, or would you like to ask me some questions, or all three?
I would just like the students or my co-learners to
Yeah.
just engage in a kind of thinking exercise because we as
Yep.
digital humanists we are always overwhelmed with making and doing and displaying and archiving and building. then maybe we should stop and think for a little while before
Yeah.
we move on to do.
Dive in. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I like that, instead of trying to define what the digital humanities are, you've taken this perspective that we can think about how we come to be interested in digital kinds of practices, digital materials, digital networks, right? And how kind of a background in the humanities might shape our expectations of what we're able to achieve, and what kind of knowledge we're meant to kind of either gain or share.
Yes.
So yeah, so I like that as a starting point, because I'm going to be very honest when I say this, and I think I've said this to my students so far. I was very thrown and put off by the digital humanities the first time I heard about it, because it
Yes.
was a bunch of
Right.
old white dudes standing around a Bible, and I was like, yeah, right? Like, that's really off-putting, especially if you're Jewish and, like a radical feminist. Like, you really don't feel like
Yeah.
it's
Right.
true,
Right.
right? And so, and then kind of taking a step back and having some like really kind of thoughtful mentors say, yes, it's men. Let's ask about why men in technology seem like two peas in a
Yes.
pod and how we can destabilize that. And I'm like, ooh, I like destabilizing things, right? And then also some very thoughtful kinds of colleagues who, are very much kinds of textual historians and work with book history and kinds of, textual markup. But they're like, there's these pictures in the book, and I have no idea what to do with them. You like art history, right? And I'm like, why, yes, I do. Let's find a way. And so, but again, this all happened kind of after my master's degree, during my doctoral work. And then, once I was kind of established within a community of practice within the UK. So kind of thinking about, what steps led to that and what steps made that possible. It's really tricky. And I like that, that kind of personal narrative is really important to your approach to networks within the digital humanities. Because as I like to tell many of my students at King's, it's like, why don't we just burn it all down and start over again? And one student very thoughtfully pointed out, we're all on visas and an arson charge would be really bad. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, so it's like, okay, yeah, like, so instead of like facing like mass deportation of my students, what can we do to kind of check our assumptions and approach this kind of question of, why don't you think I belong, right? And where do I want to belong, right? And viewing those kinds of tensions as really foundational to moving the digital humanities kind of beyond these debates about method versus practice, like, people versus, people, like, or discipline versus discipline, or like, ooh, in the digital humanities, we're so inclusive. And I'm like, really, guys? I think you might want to stop and think about your definition of inclusion, because those 15 flights of stairs I had to walk up to get here are really not that like physically inclusive. I don't run marathons and I don't like stairs. So I'm just going to wait in the lobby and
Yeah.
talk to myself for 15 to 20 minutes
Yeah.
before taking the elevator.
I was in the
Yeah,
lobby for more than 15 minutes in Kings, by the way.
oh my, that lobby is so like, I mean, I'm so sorry. Like COVID, I'm like, on the one hand, I'm like deeply saddened by the
I just
fact we
had to
couldn't meet
make
in
that
person.
joke. I'm so sorry.
No, but and it's rightfully so, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like, oh man, like, I was like sitting there and I'm like, oh my God, he's like the student who's like peering in through the window wishing, oh God, like the metaphor is just so painful. And then the next morning when I tested positive for COVID, and I'm like, I'm really glad that there was a window
Yeah.
there and that
So
I
before we
didn't give
stop the
him
recording, I
COVID.
just want to note
Yeah.
this, that you can engage your students in a kind of a thought experiment where you can ask them
Hmm.
if they have feelings and thoughts about their own positionality and how they
Hmm.
have faced certain challenges or how they can
Yeah.
address these challenges based on the conversations that I have raised or anything really.
Yeah.
They can write a line or two, a paragraph, a paper, anything that they
Yeah.
want, and
Well,
that is what I want to start channels of conversations. So I would be very
yeah.
interested in hearing what they have to say. And you can
Yeah.
give them their email ID. They can write to me. They can write to you, and you can write to me whatever you choose.
Yeah, I'll make sure to add that as My cat has decided she. Well, yes, I'm glad that you've just made off with a piece of paper. Sorry, my cats are wildly chaotic. But no, so I
Yeah,
think
so
so
I
that
will be
that kind
stopping the
of.
recording now.
Yeah, sure. Okay. But it's, one of, I think, as your